The faint hum of the ventilation system was my constant companion in the military medical facility restricted autopsy section. It was a sterile lullaby, a backdrop to the delicate work that consumed my days. Today, my focus was on a fragmented femur, its surface riddled with old trauma, evidence of a life lived hard, then ended abruptly. The bone, a relic from a century-old battlefield excavation, whispered stories of impact and decay, and I was trying to decipher its final, violent chapter. The scent of disinfectant, mingled with something deeper, more organic, clung to my scrubs. I preferred it to the cloying sweetness of fresh flowers. My gloved fingers traced the fine lines of a healed fracture, magnifier hovering just inches above the polished bone table. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh, unforgiving glow, revealing every dust mot, every minute scratch on the stainless steel. It was a world of precision, where millimeters mattered and the dead spoke through their enduring remains. I was mapping the bone's architecture, looking for microfractures, trying to determine the exact sequence of events that led to its demise, when the sharp, insistent ring of my secure line cut through the quiet. I flinched, my concentration shattering. No one called this line unless it was urgent or unusual or both. I pulled off my gloves, tossing them into the biohazard bin, and picked up the receiver, my brow furrowed. User O, I stated, my voice a little rough from disuse. User O, it's Detective Miller. A gruff voice crackled through the earpiece. Even through the static, I could hear the edge of urgency in his tone. Miller was a straight shooter, no wasted words, which meant whatever he was calling about was serious. Got something for you. Outback. Way out. I leaned against the cool metal counter, a sigh escaping me. The Outback usually meant heat, flies, and a logistical nightmare. How far out, detective, and what are we talking about? My mind was already running through my calendar, mentally clearing appointments. Opal Country, Coober Pedy region, but further. Much further. About 5 hours drive from the nearest sealed road, then another 2 on dirt tracks that barely deserve the name. He paused, letting that sink in. My internal barometer for remote was already spiking. And as for what, that's where it gets interesting and messy. Messy how? I prompted, a knot tightening in my stomach. Miller wasn't prone to hyperbole. Mining activity, specifically an abandoned opal mine shaft. Some prospectors new to the area trying their luck hit something old and something very new. My grip on the phone tightened. This was the event I'd been waiting for, the one that pulled me away from the comfortable certainty of my lab. Old and new, I repeated, my curiosity piqued despite the growing sense of foreboding. Are we talking about historical finds, a burial site? That's the initial thought, User O. They disturbed earth, found what looked like a shallow grave. Human remains, partially exposed. By the time my people got there, the wind had done some work, but it was clear enough. And old, judging by the preservation and the stratigraphy, what little we could see of it. Really old, that's where you come in. And the new part, detective. My gaze drifted back to the ancient femur on the table, a stark contrast to the unfolding narrative. The tension in the room, previously just the hum of machinery, now felt like a living presence. This is the kicker, User O. While we were securing the site, the team found something else nearby. Freshly disturbed earth, barely covered, and in it more remains, not old, not even close, we're talking fresh, and the way they were positioned. It's not an accident, not a natural death. That was the reveal/discovery. My mind immediately started piecing together the implications. Ancient human remains, undisturbed for millennia, suddenly uncovered only to be juxtaposed with a contemporary burial. The odds were astronomical. This wasn't just a dig, it was a collision of timelines. So you have a contemporary homicide, potentially connected to the excavation of ancient remains. I clarified, my voice now sharper, more focused. This was a puzzle of staggering proportions, a forensic anthropologist's nightmare and dream rolled into one. Exactly. And the preliminary findings, the way the site was arranged. It suggests a deliberate attempt to conceal the recent activity, perhaps by leveraging the older discovery as a distraction. Or maybe the older discovery is part of the contemporary issue. We don't know. It's a mess, Yuzuro. A real mess, and the location. It's the kind of place where secrets stay buried for a very long time undisturbed. The image of that remote, forgotten landscape bloomed in my mind. Vast red earth stretching to the horizon, the relentless sun, the silence broken only by the wind. A place where desperation could flourish and truth could be easily lost. This wasn't just about bones. It was about human intent, motive, and a landscape that held its secrets close. You want me to come out there and assess the scene, determine context, preservation, and advise on recovery for both sets of remains? I asked, though I already knew the answer. There was no one else for this. We need you on the ground, Yuzuro. Yesterday, we found evidence of older prospecting equipment, abandoned homesteads nearby, ghost towns, Yuzuro. And there's talk of a valuable mineral discovery, not just opals that might have been made in that same area a long time ago. My breath hitched. The stakes were suddenly far higher than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just forensic science. It was history, greed, and potentially long-simmering revenge, all bubbling to the surface in the middle of nowhere. My decision was already made. "When does the plane leave, detective?" I asked, already planning my packing list. Sun hat, sturdy boots, and every piece of specialized excavation gear I owned. The outback was calling, and its secrets felt heavy, ancient, and deadly. My breath hitched, all right. A contemporary murder, ancient remains, a cold case, and a valuable mineral discovery. My mind raced, trying to compartmentalize the information, to prepare for the inevitable tangle of evidence. The drive out to the abandoned mine felt endless, a journey into the very heart of the forgotten. The air conditioning in the four-wheel drive struggled against the relentless Australian sun, but it was a losing battle. The landscape outside blurred into a monotonous canvas of rust-red earth, sparse, resilient scrub, and a sky so vast and empty it felt like a physical weight. Every few minutes, a dust devil would spiral across the horizon, a fleeting, ephemeral column of ochre, mirroring the chaos I was about to step into. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather warm beneath my palms, my focus shifting from the road ahead to the mental checklist I was already running through. Taphonomy, trauma, context, time. We finally crested a low ridge and the mine appeared, a stark, brutal scar on the land. It wasn't a grand, industrial operation, but a collection of ramshackle corrugated iron sheds, a skeletal headframe silhouetted against the brilliant blue, and mounds of spoil heaps that looked like giant, petrified ant nests. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the whine of the wind through the derelict structures and the crunch of our tires on the gravel track. Dust, fine as talcum powder, coated everything, a perpetual shroud. A small cluster of vehicles marked the scene. A couple of police cruisers, a forensic services van, and another unmarked four-wheel drive. The area around what looked like the main shaft was cordoned off with yellow tape, fluttering like prayer flags in the hot breeze. A single officer stood guard, his uniform already dusted red, looking like a sentinel against the vast emptiness. I killed the engine and the sudden quiet was deafening. Stepping out, the heat hit me like a physical blow, dry and suffocating. The air smelled of baked earth, sun-warmed metal, and something else, a faint, acrid tang that I couldn't quite place. I pulled my wide-brimmed hat lower, grabbed my kit bag, and started towards the cordon. A tall, lean detective, his face already streaked with grime, met me at the tape. He offered a curt nod. "Yuzuro, thanks for getting here so fast." His voice was gravelly, tired. "Detective Roll last name." "No problem," I replied, my voice a little hoarse from the dry air. "What have we got?" He gestured towards a section of disturbed earth near the base of one of the larger spoil heaps. The prospector who found them was looking for new seams. Said his machinery snagged something. Thought it was just an old tree root at first. Then he saw bone. I ducked under the tape, my eyes immediately drawn to the excavation site. The ground here was a mess of freshly turned soil, a stark contrast to the sun-baked, compacted earth surrounding it. The edges of the trench were sharp, the clods of dirt still loose and crumbly, clearly indicating very recent activity. And there, partially exposed, were the bones. My gaze locked onto them. A femur, a section of pelvis, and what looked like a fragmented skull. They weren't the clean, white bones one might expect from a medical diagram. These were stained a deep, earthy brown, almost petrified in places, with a texture that suggested immense age. Fragile, brittle, they were clearly ancient. The cortical bone was thin, almost translucent in places, and the trabecular bone, where visible, showed signs of significant post-mortem degradation. This was the jarring contradiction I'd been warned about. Yet the disturbance around them was undeniably fresh, the tool marks in the surrounding soil crisp and modern. Someone very recently had been digging here and had unearthed something profoundly old. "They look old," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. I knelt carefully at the edge of the excavation, my gloved hands hovering over the scene, not touching anything yet. The prospector's machinery had clearly done some damage, fragmenting some of the smaller bones and scattering others. This would complicate recovery immensely. "That's what we thought," the detective confirmed, his voice low. But then we found something else nearby. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but my trained eye picked it up immediately. A different kind of discoloration, one that hinted at organic matter, perhaps even blood, that hadn't had millennia to leach into the earth. And then a glint of metal in the disturbed earth, partially buried. A spent shell casing, modern in design. My internal thoughts spiraled. Ancient bones, yes, but a fresh disturbance, a possible modern bloodstain, and a contemporary shell casing. This was a collision of timelines, a violent meeting of past and present. Someone had dug here recently, perhaps looking for something else entirely, and stumbled upon these ancient remains. Or more disturbingly, they had known the ancient remains were here and used their presence to conceal a much more recent crime. "This is complicated," I said finally. "We've got layers here, detective. Layers of time, layers of activity." My mind immediately went to the methodical process of exhumation, the careful documentation, the painstaking analysis that would follow. It was a daunting prospect, especially given the remote location and the destructive nature of the initial discovery. I knew these remains, once meticulously recovered, would eventually make their way to the sterile environment of the military medical facility restricted autopsy section, where the true story locked within their structure could finally begin to be told. But first, we had to get them out of this harsh, unforgiving landscape. The journey from the opal mine to the makeshift laboratory felt endless, the corrugated iron track rattling my bones as much as the vehicle's suspension. The sun, a malevolent eye in the vast blue sky, had begun its slow descent, painting the distant horizon in bruised purples and fiery oranges. We'd loaded the delicate bone blocks, meticulously encased in plaster and foam, into a specially designated transport cooler, each jostle a fresh spike of anxiety for the fragile evidence within. The detective had insisted on escorting the remains personally, his gaze fixed on the cooler with a vigilance that matched my own. Finally, as dusk bled into true night, we arrived at the designated site, a secure, repurposed section within a remote military medical facility restricted autopsy section. The air here, even inside the building, felt different, cooler, conditioned, carrying the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something deeper, more organic. The doors were thick, sound-dampening, and required multiple keycard swipes and biometric scans to access. The security measures were overkill for a standard forensic analysis, but then, this was hardly a standard case. The military medical facility restricted autopsy section was starkly utilitarian. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, shadowless glare on the stainless steel tables and sealed cabinets. A row of specialized equipment, usually reserved for classified pathology, stood ready. My field kit, surprisingly comprehensive, was already laid out on a side counter, thanks to a diligent logistics officer. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers, and took a deep, steadying breath. This was where the real work began, away from the dust and flies, in a controlled environment where every minute detail could be scrutinized. The first step was to carefully unwrap the plaster jackets. I used a fine-toothed saw, making slow, deliberate cuts, the plaster dust settling like fine snow on the clean sheet beneath. Each section of earth, still clinging to the bone, was a precious, fragile testament to its burial environment. I worked in silence. The only sounds were of the air conditioning and the occasional clink of a tool. The detective stood quietly by the doorway, a silent sentinel, his presence a constant reminder of the urgency and the stakes involved. As the last of the plaster fell away, the first skeletal elements were revealed. A partial skull, a few vertebrae, and the shaft of a femur, still partially embedded in the compacted soil matrix. The bones were a deep, earthy brown, stained by centuries of mineral absorption, their surfaces smooth from the slow erosion of time. They were old, undeniably ancient. My initial assessment at the mine had been correct. I began the painstaking process of cleaning, using soft brushes and wooden picks to gently remove the clinging earth, sifting every grain for micro-evidence. It was like peeling back layers of time, each brushstroke revealing more of the individual's story. I worked systematically, quadrant by quadrant, my magnifying visor pressed close to the bone. Minutes bled into hours, my focus absolute. Then I saw it. On the left parietal bone of the skull, partially obscured by a tenacious clod of dirt, was a distinctive depression. It wasn't a post-mortem fracture, the kind that occurs when bones break after death due to earth pressure or excavation damage. This was different. The edges were beveled inwards, the bone showing concentric fracturing radiating outwards from the impact point, characteristic of a forceful blow. The bone around the impact site exhibited signs of healing, indicating the individual had survived the initial injury, but the injury itself was significant. This was perimortem trauma, an injury sustained around the time of death, when the bone was still green and elastic, suggesting violence. My breath hitched. Ancient bones, ancient violence. My mind raced, trying to reconcile this with the fresh excavation. Was this a ritualistic killing from millennia ago, disturbed by a modern event, or something far more complex? I carefully photographed the injury from multiple angles, meticulously documenting its size, shape, and location. I continued cleaning, my senses heightened, every movement precise. I moved to the femur shaft, gently brushing away the last vestiges of soil. And that's when I noticed a minuscule, almost imperceptible shimmer caught in a hairline fissure on the bone's surface. It wasn't natural mineral sparkle. I leaned closer, adjusting the focus on my stereo microscope. Under magnification, the shimmer resolved into a few minute, translucent fibers, almost colorless, interwoven into the bone's texture. These weren't natural fibers. They were too uniform, too synthetic in their appearance. Under the scope, it looked like a fragment of polymer, a tiny, irregular chip of plastic. It was too small to identify definitively, but its very presence, nestled alongside fibers that screamed man-made, confirmed my suspicions. These materials were modern. They were utterly out of place on bones that had lain undisturbed for thousands of years. The fibers could have come from a contemporary garment, a glove, a tarp. The polymer fragment, perhaps from a tool, a container, or even a piece of personal equipment. Their presence, however subtle, unequivocally linked these ancient remains to a very recent disturbance, and more significantly, to the perpetrator of that disturbance. This wasn't just an ancient burial disturbed. This was a crime scene spanning millennia. The freshly disturbed earth at the mine suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. My internal monologue was a rapid-fire series of questions. How did these modern materials get here? Were they accidentally transferred during excavation? Or were they deposited during a struggle, a fight over whatever secrets these ancient bones held? The perimortem trauma on the skull, combined with these modern traces, painted a picture of a desperate confrontation, one that had disturbed the sleep of the long dead. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent current between myself and the detective who had watched my movements, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "These bones," I said, my voice low, "they tell a story, an old one of violence." The ground had given up its secrets, but those secrets were only deepening the mystery. The sterile hum of the air filtration system was the only constant companion in the military medical facility restricted autopsy section. My focus, however, was on the delicate fragments scattered across my examination table. Days had blurred into a rhythm of meticulous measurement, precise notation, and careful reconstruction. The initial assessment of the main skeletal remains was largely complete. A male, somewhere in his late 40s to early 60s, robust build, around 175-180 cm tall. Evidence of healed fractures on a rib and a metacarpal suggested a life lived with some physical hardship. The bone itself, while showing signs of degradation consistent with decades in the earth, was clearly ancient, predating any modern settlement in the region. But then there were the anomalies, the jarring notes in this ancient symphony. The synthetic fibers I'd found near the skull, the ones that had gleamed under the microscope, had undergone further scrutiny by a colleague in trace evidence. Definitely modern, she'd confirmed over the phone earlier that morning, her voice clipped and professional. Polypropylene, common in outdoor gear, ropes, even some industrial applications. No specific source identified yet, but it's not from the 1800s, Usero. Not even close. This confirmation had solidified my initial suspicion. This wasn't just a simple discovery of ancient remains. It was something far more sinister, a modern crime scene superimposed upon a burial from centuries past. Ready to brief, Usero. The voice of the lead investigator, a burly woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, cut through my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her presence filling the sterile space with a sense of urgent expectation. She carried a thick file folder, its edges worn from use. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, gesturing to the reconstructed skull and several trays of bones. "Come in. I've got some preliminary findings that I think will complicate things if they weren't complicated enough already." She moved to the side of the table, her gaze sweeping over the bones, then settling on my face. "Complicate how?" "The primary individual," I began, tapping a finger on the parietal bone, "is an adult male, likely Aboriginal, dating back several hundred years. He suffered significant perimortem trauma, blunt force to the skull, consistent with a heavy object. This wasn't a natural death. It was a violent one long ago." I paused, allowing that to sink in. But that's not the whole story. The site itself, the way the grave was disturbed, the presence of modern synthetic fibers, it points to a very recent intrusion. Someone dug him up, and whoever did, they left behind evidence of themselves. The lead investigator's brow furrowed. "So we're looking at a desecration possibly, and then, what? A second, more recent crime." "It's more specific than desecration," I corrected, picking up a small, sealed bag containing the fibers. "These fibers, polypropylene, are entirely modern. They were found intertwined with the disturbed soil right around the ancient skull. My theory is that someone recently unearthed these remains, perhaps stumbled upon them. In doing so, committed an act that led to another, more recent crime, or at least left evidence of one." She nodded slowly, a thoughtful glint in her eyes. "You're suggesting the current disturbance isn't just a random act, tied to something contemporary." "Exactly," I affirmed. "The ancient remains are the fulcrum, the point of intersection. They were found in an active opal mining area. Remember, the new disturbance, the freshly turned earth, wasn't just haphazard, it was purposeful. Someone was digging there and they found something, or perhaps they were looking for something." The lead investigator reached for him worn file folder, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "Your findings, Usero, they align with some of the speculation we've been having. The opal field has always attracted prospectors, some legitimate, some less so. We've got a number of cold cases from that region stretching back decades, mostly missing persons presumed lost to the desert or the mines. She flipped through the papers, her finger tracing lines of text, but one in particular has always bothered me. A prospector, a man named Bartholomew Barty Finch, vanished without a trace almost 50 years ago. Left his claim, his meager camp, everything, just gone. My breath hitched. 50 years ago. I looked from the fibers in my hand to the ancient skull on the table. He was known for being a bit of a loner, tenacious. She continued, her voice gaining a new edge of urgency. Always convinced he was on the verge of a major find. The last anyone saw of him, he was heading deeper into the rough country, past the established claims, towards an area known for untouched ground. She pulled out a faded, grainy photograph, a black and white image of a lean, weathered man with a wide-brimmed hat obscuring part of his face. His determined jawline was clear. Descriptions from that time say he was around 5'10" to 6'0", fit for his age, somewhere in his late 40s, early 50s. Had a distinctive scar over his left eyebrow from a mining accident years prior. My mind raced, connecting the dots. 5'10" to 6 feet, late 40s, early 50s, robust build. My gaze fell to the reconstructed skull again, then to the ancient bone fragments. The ancient remains are a male, around 175-180 cm, late 40s to early 60s, robust build. But these are ancient remains, the lead investigator said, her voice dropping, as if voicing the unsettling thought aloud. Barty Finch vanished 50 years ago. He wouldn't be ancient. No, I agreed, my voice barely a whisper. He wouldn't. But what if he found something ancient? What if he was the one who disturbed this grave? What if his disappearance is directly tied to this very spot, to these bones? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The description of Bartholomew Finch was too close to the general profile of the modern individual. I was starting to imagine the one who had disturbed the ancient burial, the one whose modern fibers I held. His family always maintained he wouldn't just leave, she mused, more to herself than to me. Said he was obsessed with finding that big opal. She looked at me, a sudden, sharp clarity in her eyes. We need to re-examine everything we have on Bartholomew Finch, every single detail. Yuzuro, this isn't just about ancient bones anymore. It's about a man who vanished and a decades-old secret that might have just been unearthed, quite literally. The military medical facility restricted autopsy section, usually a place of quiet scientific contemplation, now felt charged with an almost palpable tension. The past wasn't just intruding, it was demanding answers, and it felt like it had brought a modern ghost with it. The military medical facility restricted autopsy section, usually a place of quiet scientific contemplation, now felt charged with an almost palpable tension. The cold case of Bartholomew Finch had just collided head-on with my ancient discovery, sending ripples across 50 years of silence. The pathologist, a man whose placid demeanor rarely cracked, had simply stared at the old photograph, then back at the femur I'd presented. His only utterance, a low whistle, spoke volumes. "So, Yuzuro," the detective had said, his voice a gravelly murmur as we stood by the stainless steel table, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. "We're looking at two separate incidents, potentially, or one very convoluted one spanning decades." I ran a gloved hand over the cool metal surface. "It's more than potential, detective. The bone pathology points to an individual living around the late 19th, early 20th century. Finch disappeared in the 1970s. Unless he had a particularly aggressive time-traveling hobby. These aren't the same person, but the location. That's where they connect. Someone buried my ancient individual, and then, decades later, someone else disturbed that grave, perhaps to bury Finch, or perhaps to hide something else entirely. My mind raced, trying to bridge the half-century gap. What could link an early miner to a missing person from the 70s? The opal, of course. It always came back to the opal. My hypothesis was clear. The first set of remains belonged to an early prospector, perhaps murdered for a claim or a find. The second, more recent disturbance suggested a later crime, possibly related to the original or simply using the remote, forgotten grave as a convenient hiding spot. I needed to go back to the mine, not just for a recovery, but for a full-scale archaeological excavation. The previous visit had been a rapid assessment. Now, it had to be methodical, forensic. The drive back to the opal mine was long, the landscape blurring into a familiar tapestry of red earth and sparse, resilient scrub. This time, I wasn't alone. A small team of my colleagues, along with 2 police officers and the detective, followed in a convoy of dusty 4-wheel drives. The sun beat down relentlessly, a blinding white disk in a sky of bleached blue. Even with the air conditioning blasting, the heat seeped into the vehicle, a constant, oppressive presence. My determination, however, was a cool counterpoint. The derelict structures, the rusted machinery, the gaping maw of the shaft, they all seemed to watch us, guarding their secrets. The ground around the initial discovery had been cordoned off with bright yellow tape, a jarring splash of modernity against the ancient, sun-baked earth. "All right, team," I announced, pulling on my wide-brimmed hat and adjusting my sunglasses. "We're expanding our search grid. I want a full-meter radius around the original discovery, extending down. We're looking for anything that might indicate a struggle, any tools, personal effects, or further remains. Take your time." The initial layers were familiar: loose soil, small rocks, the occasional shard of rusted metal. But as we went deeper, the character of the earth began to change. I knelt, carefully brushing away a layer of compacted clay. That's when I saw it, a distinct, unnatural pattern in the soil directly beneath where the initial remains had been found. "Hold on," I called out, my voice hushed. My colleagues paused, their movements ceasing. "Look here." I pointed with my trowel. "See these depressions and this linear disturbance?" The detective crouched beside me, his brow furrowed. "Drag marks." "Possibly," I confirmed, my gaze sweeping the small area. "They're subtle, but consistent with something heavy being pulled across the ground before it was backfilled. And look here." I carefully excavated a small pocket of soil, revealing a glint of dull metal. It wasn't a standard pickaxe or shovel. It was smaller, heavier than it looked, with a crudely forged, chisel-like head, not factory-made. I nodded, carefully bagging the tool. "It suggests the individual was involved in mining or at least familiar with it. And these marks," I returned to the soil, "they suggest a struggle, or at the very least a body being moved after death, not just carefully placed." The tension in the air thickened, palpable now. This wasn't just a burial, it was a cover-up. We continued our meticulous work, each scoop of earth bringing us closer to understanding. The sun climbed higher, relentless, baking the red dust into our skin and clothes. Sweat trickled down my back, but I barely noticed. My focus was absolute. Then one of my colleagues let out a sharp intake of breath. "Yuzuro, over here." I scrambled over, my heart giving a sudden hard thump against my ribs. About a meter deeper, and slightly to the side of the original discovery, a new outline was emerging from the earth. Not just bone, but a more complete form. As I carefully brushed away the last of the clinging soil, the full extent of the discovery became horrifyingly clear. It was a second set of human remains, lying in a contorted, unnatural position. The first set had been disarticulated, scattered. This one was largely articulated, but clearly not at rest. One arm was bent at an impossible angle, the skull turned sharply to the side. This individual was buried in a way that screamed violence, not reverence. The first remains had been a mystery. These were a tragedy, stark and immediate. The bones were discolored, but intact enough to see. The jaw was clenched, and a long, thin fracture snaked across the left parietal bone of the skull. This was no accident. This was murder. And the position, the signs of struggle, the unique mining tool nearby, it all painted a clearer, far more brutal picture of the original crime. My ancient prospector hadn't just died. They had been fought over, killed, and then hastily buried deep in the forgotten heart of the opal country. It wasn't just a few more bones. It was an entire, articulated skeleton, lying partially on its side, almost as if it had crumpled into the earth. The soil around it was different, looser, a darker, fresher ochre than the sun-baked, compacted earth that had entombed the ancient remains. This was no prehistoric burial. This was recent. The skeleton wore remnants of clothing, a tattered, heavy-duty work shirt, its once bright blue faded and stained, and tough denim trousers, one leg snagged on what looked like a boot. No ancient ochre ceremony here, just the grim evidence of a modern, brutal end. My breath hitched. The old tragedy had a new, grim echo. The recovery was meticulous, every fragment of cloth, every loose button, every pebble of soil bagged and tagged. The detective, his face grim, supervised the extraction, his usual gruffness softened by the gravity of the find. We worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the vast, empty landscape, the air growing sharp with the chill of the desert night. The next morning, the evidence, carefully packed into secure transport, was on its way, and so was I. The journey back to civilization was a blur of dust and contemplation. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the two distinct timelines now intertwined in that forgotten mine shaft. Steel gleamed under fluorescent lights, reflecting off sterile surfaces. It felt less like a place of healing and more like a high-tech crucible for truth, hidden deep within a secured perimeter. I signed in, the heavy door clanking shut behind me, sealing me into an environment designed for absolute control. My designated bay was prepared, the modern remains laid out on a stainless steel table covered by a white sheet. The air was cool, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something metallic. I pulled on my gloves, the latex snapping against my wrists, and took a deep, steadying breath. Usero, I reminded myself, focus. I began with the clothing. The work shirt, though heavily degraded, bore a faint, embroidered logo on the pocket, a stylized pickaxe over a jagged mineral crystal, not a common design. The denim trousers, too, were robust, reinforced at the knees. These were clothes built for hard labor for a mine. The boots, what remained of them, were heavy-duty, steel-toed. This individual was a miner, or at least someone accustomed to working in such an environment. Carefully, I sifted through the soil samples taken from around the modern remains. The consistency was different from the surrounding earth, softer, suggesting recent disturbance. But it was the inclusions that caught my eye. Mixed within the fine, red dust were tiny, iridescent chips, not the dull, milky opal fragments I'd seen scattered around the old mine entrance. These were vibrant, almost fiery, catching the overhead lights with flashes of emerald green and electric blue. Potch, the common, valueless opal, was usually opaque. These were something else entirely. I meticulously collected the chips, placing them into a small, sterile Petri dish. Under the microscope, their brilliance intensified. These weren't just common opal, these were precious opal. My internal monologue shifted from forensic observation to geological deduction. The old mine was primarily for common opal, found in the sedimentary layers. But precious opal, especially of this quality, often formed in different geological conditions, sometimes in volcanic rock, in newer fissures or veins. This wasn't just a random find. It hinted at a specific, lucrative deposit. I moved to the skeletal remains, cataloging injuries, looking for clues to the manner of death. A fracture on the left temporal bone, consistent with a blunt force trauma. Not a fall, not a collapse. This was an impact, a deliberate blow. There were no defensive wounds on the arms, suggesting a surprise attack, or perhaps the individual was already incapacitated. Then a glint. Tucked deep within the folds of the tattered shirt near the chest cavity, I found it. A small, roughly cut stone the size of my thumbnail. It was a raw opal, but unlike the chips, this one was a single, glorious piece. It pulsed with a deep, blood-red fire, interspersed with streaks of fiery orange and violet. It was a black opal, the most valuable kind, and of an exceptional quality. It felt warm against my gloved palm, almost alive. Reveal/discovery. This wasn't just any black opal. Its specific color play and matrix indicated a very particular geological signature. I had seen geological survey reports for the region years ago, detailing potential undiscovered black opal veins, but nothing concrete had ever been found. This stone, and the chips from the soil, suggested a new vein had been struck, and recently. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The ancient remains spoke of a historical tragedy, a forgotten claim. But this modern skeleton, with its blunt force trauma and the exquisite black opal clutched to its chest, told a different, far more urgent story. Someone had found a new, incredibly valuable opal vein in that forgotten landscape, and someone had killed for it. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The disturbed earth, the modern clothes, the brutal injury, and this magnificent, deadly stone. The ancient tragedy was not just a historical curiosity, it was a distraction, a cover-up. The modern death wasn't an isolated incident. The discovery of this black opal meant immense wealth, and with it, immense power. Someone, a ruthless individual or a powerful corporation, was actively exploiting this new find, willing to kill to keep it secret. The remote outback, I now understood, was not just a forgotten landscape. It was a battleground, and I had just stepped onto it. My determination solidified into a grim resolve. This wasn't just about finding answers for the dead. It was about exposing a living, breathing threat. The journey from the mine site was meticulous. The remains, now carefully jacketed in plaster and cradled in custom-built crates, were transported with the reverence usually reserved for ancient relics, not murder victims. We needed a facility equipped for such delicate work, and given the potential historical overlap and the sheer remoteness, the military medical facility restricted autopsy section was the logical, if slightly unusual, choice. Its sterile, hushed environment was a stark contrast to the dust and raw earth of the outback, but the precision offered here was exactly what I needed. Days blurred into a focused rhythm of examination. The air in the autopsy section, despite its clinical filtration, always carried that faint metallic tang. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unwavering glow on the stainless steel table where the skeleton lay. I worked methodically, each brushstroke, each caliper measurement a step closer to understanding. The initial findings at the mine had suggested a violent end, and here, under optimal conditions, the story began to coalesce with chilling clarity. The skull bore the definitive marks of blunt force trauma, not just one impact, but several, clustered around the left temporoparietal region. The fractures were stellate, radiating outwards, consistent with a heavy, angular object. But it wasn't just the damage that told a tale. Embedded in one of the deeper fractures, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a minute fleck of material. Under the microscope, its crystalline structure shimmered, catching the light. Opal. Not the common potch, but a fragment of precious black opal, unlike anything I'd seen in the surface deposits of the old mine. This was the vibrant, high-value material that had sparked the modern interest. This fragment was a fingerprint, a signature from the weapon, a direct link between the ancient death and the contemporary scramble for wealth. I leaned back, pushing a strand of hair from my forehead. The detective, a man named Miller with a perpetually furrowed brow and an uncanny ability to materialize silently, stood in the doorway, observing my silent intensity. "Something more, Usero?" he inquired, his voice a low rumble. I gestured to the magnified image on the screen beside the table. "This," I answered, pointing to the shimmering fleck. "Black opal and the fracture patterns. They're distinct, consistent with a specific type of tool, a heavy, angled one. Not a pickaxe, not quite a hammer, something with a broad, flat face, possibly with a slightly blunted edge, used repeatedly." Miller stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the screen. "You're saying this isn't just an old death in an old mine. This is about this mine now." "Precisely," I confirmed. "The victim died from these blows, and the weapon left a calling card, a very valuable calling card." I turned to him. Have you had any luck tracing who acquired the specific rights to that black opal vein or who's been operating there recently? He nodded slowly. There's a local prospector, a recluse named Finch. Been trying to stake a claim on that specific section for years. Finally got it last year, just before the new finds started coming in. He's got a reputation for being possessive. Possessive enough to kill. I questioned, my voice flat. Miller's jaw tightened. The old cold case, the missing prospector from decades ago. His claim overlapped with Finch's family's original staking. A territorial dispute potentially that just got reignited with the new discovery. The pieces clicked. The old death, the new valuable mineral, the missing person. Now a suspect with a history. We need to talk to Finch, I stated, the exhaustion of the past few days giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. And we need to see his tools. The journey to Finch's property was a long, dusty affair. The detective's aging utility vehicle kicking up plumes of red earth. It was a ramshackle collection of corrugated iron sheds and rusted machinery, miles from the nearest paved road. Miller pulled up near a dilapidated shed that served as a workshop. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and something else, something metallic and sharp. We found Finch inside, hunched over a grinding wheel, sparks showering from the metal he was working on. He was a wiry man with sun-leathered skin and eyes that held a wary, almost hostile glint. Finch, Miller began, his voice calm but firm, we need to ask you a few questions about your mining operations. Finch straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. What's the trouble, officer? Just minding my own business. His gaze flickered to me, lingering for a moment on my forensic kit bag. We're investigating a discovery near your claim. I interjected, stepping forward. An old death possibly related to an old claim dispute. I watched his face carefully, searching for a flicker of recognition. A tell. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of weathered indifference. It was cluttered, a veritable museum of mining implements. My gaze settled on a heavy, specialized splitting maul leaning against a workbench. It had a broad, flat face on one side and a slightly blunted, angled edge on the other, designed for breaking open stubborn rock. A faint, reddish-brown stain marred its surface, partially obscured by rust and grime. That splitting maul, I responded, pointing to it, cutting across Miller's questioning. May I examine it? Finch's eyes narrowed. A sudden tension stiffened his posture. Just an old tool, he grunted, moving to block my path. Nothing special. On the contrary, I replied, my voice steady, it looks quite specialized, and that stain, I'd like to take a closer look. Miller stepped between us, placing a hand on Finch's shoulder. User needs to do him job, Finch. No harm in looking at a tool, is there? Finch hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside, his eyes never leaving me. I picked up the maul. It was heavier than it looked. My fingers brushed over the faint reddish-brown stain. It wasn't rust, not entirely. I scraped a tiny sample with a sterile blade, securing it in a sterile vial. Then I looked closer at the broad, flat face. There, caught in a tiny crevice near the edge, was a minute, glistening shard. It was barely visible, but I knew what it was. Black opal. The maul, the fragment, the specific fracture pattern, it all clicked into place with horrifying precision. A sudden, sharp movement. Finch, his face contorted into a mask of pure rage, lunged. He wasn't aiming for me, but for the maul in my hand. He must have seen the sudden realization in my eyes. Before Miller could fully react, Finch had grabbed a heavy, rusted pipe from the workbench. The air crackled with a sudden, primal threat. The pipe arced towards me, the metallic gleam a terrifying harbinger of peril. Then I looked at the detective, a silent understanding passing between us. The maul, now bagged and tagged, was just one piece. The real work began now, away from the dust and the scorching sun. The air in the military medical facility restricted autopsy section was a stark contrast to the outback. Here, the sterile chill bit at my skin, a constant hum of ventilation systems the only soundtrack. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unwavering glare on stainless steel tables, and the array of instruments laid out with meticulous precision. The faint, clinical scent of disinfectant struggled to mask the deeper, metallic tang that clung to everything. I peeled off my outer layers, donning fresh scrubs and latex gloves, my mind already sifting through the evidence. The maul lay on a sterile sheet, its heavy head still bearing the faint reddish-brown smear I'd sampled. My initial field test had confirmed blood. Now, under the powerful magnification of the stereo microscope, I could discern the individual dried cellular components. The lab technician, a quiet woman with sharp, observant eyes, worked diligently beside me preparing the DNA extraction. "We're looking for a match to the modern victim," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "But also any other profiles. Old blood, new blood. The whole story is in that rust-colored stain." My gaze drifted to the other table where the ancient remains, meticulously cleaned and reassembled, lay alongside the few items recovered from the grave. Fragments of a worn leather pouch, a tarnished brass buckle, a handful of unusual milky white stones raw opal. These were the keys, I knew, connecting the past to the present. I was hunched over the maul, meticulously scraping away a stubborn speck of dried clay from a crevice near the handle, when the door to the section hissed open. I straightened, my muscles protesting the sudden movement. It was Finch. His face was a mask of strained politeness, but his eyes, I noticed, held a glint of something sharper, something desperate. "Just checking on progress, Yuzuro," he added, his voice a little too smooth for the stark environment. He took a step further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the tables, lingering on the maul, then the bones. The lab technician instinctively moved a little closer to her equipment, a subtle shift that didn't escape me. "We're making good progress," I replied, my tone deliberately neutral. "The preliminary findings are illuminating." I didn't elaborate, watching him. He was too far from the entrance now. My gut tightened. This wasn't a casual check-in. He advanced further, his hands clasped behind his back. "Illuminating, how so?" His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the ancient remains. "Just old bones, aren't they? A prospector who probably just wandered off, got lost." "No," I stated, my voice firm. "These bones show clear signs of perimortem trauma, and the modern victim, he wasn't just found. He was murdered, and I believe the weapon used was right here." I tapped the maul with a gloved finger. Finch stopped dead just a few feet from me. His composure cracked. "You can't prove that," he spat, his voice dropping, a raw edge of panic surfacing. "You don't have enough." "I have enough," I countered, my eyes locking with his. "The blood on this maul is a match for the modern victim, and the soil samples taken from the maul head, they match the specific mineral composition of the earth from the opal mine. Not just any mine, that mine." His jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake. You're going to ruin everything." He lunged, not for me, but for the maul. He intended to smash it, to destroy the evidence. My training kicked in. I reacted instantly. My right hand swept across the table, knocking over a tray of sterile scalpels with a clatter, but my left grabbed a heavy stainless steel bone saw. It was a substantial piece of equipment, not meant for combat, but it had weight and a serrated edge. As he reached for the maul, I swung the saw in a wide, defensive arc, not aiming to injure, but to create distance and a barrier. The flat side of the blade connected with his forearm with a dull thud. He recoiled with a grunt of pain, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with surprise and fury. "You crazy bitch! Stay back," I warned, my voice low and steady, the saw held between us like a shield. My mind raced, assessing my options. The lab technician had frozen, her face pale, but he was already inching towards the emergency call button on the wall. "Good." Finch recovered quickly, his eyes darting around, looking for another approach, another weapon. He spotted a heavy dissecting hammer on a nearby cart. He moved towards it. I needed to buy time. My gaze swept the room, landing on the array of chemicals. A beaker of concentrated formaldehyde sat on a side bench, used for tissue preservation. It was volatile, pungent, and highly irritating. As he reached for the hammer, I grabbed the beaker. With a flick of my wrist, I splashed a small amount towards him. He cried out, not from a direct hit, but from the sudden acrid fumes that billowed up, stinging his eyes and throat. He staggered back, coughing violently, momentarily disoriented. That was all the lab technician needed. Her finger slammed down on the emergency button. A piercing, insistent alarm blared through the restricted section, echoing off the sterile surfaces. Finch, blinded by the fumes and the sudden noise, stumbled. Security personnel, alerted by the alarm, burst through the door moments later, their faces grim. They quickly subdued him, pulling him away, still coughing and muttering threats. I stood there, the bone saw still clutched in my hand, the beaker of formaldehyde still slightly dripping. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady. The danger had passed. The evidence was safe. The detective arrived shortly after, his face etched with concern. "User O, are you all right?" "I'm fine," I answered, setting the bone saw down. "But I think we just got our confession." I gestured to the mall. "The blood on this, it's the modern victims. And the soil, it's from the mine. The mall was used to kill him, just as it was used decades ago to kill the original prospector." I turned to the ancient remains. The original prospector, he found the opal. He was likely killed by a member of the family who now owns that land. The family Finch is so desperately trying to protect. They buried him, kept the opal a secret, built their wealth on it. Decades later, the modern victim, a descendant of the original murderers, or perhaps someone who stumbled upon the truth, tried to expose it. He found the bones, or perhaps the opal cache. He was silenced brutally with the same weapon that killed the first man. The mall, the family secret, the stolen wealth, it all came full circle. I picked up one of the milky white opal stones from the ancient prospector's belongings. This isn't just any opal. It's a specific type, unique to that particular vein. We found similar samples in the modern victim's possession. He was trying to prove the original claim, to expose the lie. The detective looked at the evidence, then at me, a profound understanding dawning in his eyes. So, the modern victim wasn't just a random discovery. He was trying to right a decades-old wrong, and it cost him his life. "Precisely," I confirmed. "And Finch, he was protecting his family, their legacy built on blood and lies. The mall, the opal, the two bodies, they tell a complete story. A story of greed, murder, and a desperate struggle for truth in a forgotten landscape. Justice, for the forgotten, was finally within reach." The sterile air in the military medical facility restricted autopsy section always had a faint, metallic tang, a smell that clung to my scrubs even after I'd changed. Today, it felt heavier, thick with the weight of finality. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a stark, shadowless glow on the polished stainless steel tables and the rows of meticulously labeled specimen jars. My hands, gloved and steady, moved over the last of the reports. A thick stack of paper detailing every fracture, every soil particulate, every microscopic anomaly we'd painstakingly cataloged. The detective, a man whose face had grown perceptibly wearier over the weeks, sat across from me, his pen hovering over the signature line of the final identification form for the contemporary victim. "So this is it, User O?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper in the cavernous room. I nodded, pushing a folder across the table. "This is it. The DNA evidence is conclusive. Dental records match. The unique skeletal trauma aligns perfectly with the weapon recovered and the narrative we pieced together." I tapped the folder. The remains of the contemporary victim, now definitively identified as the prospector missing for decades, can finally be returned to his family. And the ancient remains, well, their story is complete too. My gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where, under a clean sheet, lay the carefully articulated bones of the ancient individual. They were no longer evidence. They were a person, finally given a name by proxy, the first discoverer, the original inhabitant of that harsh land, whose life had ended violently, thousands of years ago, only to be disturbed by another act of violence in the present day. It was a strange, poetic symmetry, a cruel echo across millennia. A junior pathologist moved quietly, preparing the ancient remains for their eventual journey, a respectful reburial arranged with the local indigenous community. I watched her, observing the gentle precision of her movements. There was a reverence in the air, a quiet understanding that these bones had borne witness to a history far deeper than any written record. I thought back to the scorching heat of the outback, the red dust that had coated everything, the oppressive silence of the abandoned opal mine. It felt like a lifetime ago, though only weeks had passed. The memory of the freshly disturbed earth, the glint of bone under the harsh sun, was still vivid. It had been a scene of profound desolation, yet within it lay the seeds of two separate tragedies, two lives cut short, waiting for someone to listen to their silent testimonies. The contemporary victim's death, driven by greed and desperation over the opal discovery, had been a brutal, calculated act. The initial evidence, a mix of ancient and modern, had been a deliberate obfuscation, a desperate attempt to bury the truth deeper than the deepest mine shaft. But bones, I'd learned long ago, were incorruptible storytellers. They held their secrets close, but given the right interpreter, they would always eventually speak. The tension in the room wasn't the kind that preceded a new discovery, but rather the quiet, almost painful tension of closure. It was the weight of knowing the truth, of having seen the evidence of human cruelty and resilience laid bare, had roots stretching back decades. It's a lot to untangle. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Thank you, truly. Without you, those bones would have just been bones, and that prospector would still be a name on a missing persons list. I appreciated his words, but the credit wasn't mine alone. It belonged to every fiber of scientific inquiry, to every lab technician, every officer who had sweated in the sun, every specialist who had contributed to the tapestry of evidence. My role was simply to connect the dots, to translate the language of the deceased. My gaze returned to the covered form in the corner. The ancient individual had been a silent witness to the land for millennia, their presence a testament to human endurance. Now they were finally free to return to the earth, their story understood, their dignity restored. And the prospector, whose pursuit of fortune had led to his demise, would also find his peace. The vastness of the Australian landscape, with its ancient secrets and its contemporary struggles, felt a little less forgotten today. The silent, red earth held countless tales, and every now and then it offered one up, begging for it to be heard. Our work was to listen. And as I gathered my own reports, the metallic tang of the facility seemed to dissipate, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible scent of dust and ancient earth, an echo of the forgotten landscape, now finally at rest. Justice for the forgotten was finally delivered.